Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. Downing Street says the Prime Minister remains clinically stable in hospital and is responding to treatment. He's in intensive care, suffering from severe symptoms of coronavirus. Number 10 says Boris Johnson remains in good spirits. The Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who is deputising for Mr Johnson, chaired the regular morning meeting to discuss the government's coronavirus strategy. Ministers are insisting it's too early to start easing the lockdown restrictions, which were put in place more than 2 weeks ago. Here's our political correspondent, Nick Eardley.
Very little is normal around here just now. Westminster would usually be buzzing with activity on a Wednesday morning. Instead, the streets, like so much of the country, are empty. Behind closed doors, ministers have diverted huge resources to fighting the coronavirus. The Prime Minister, though, remains here this afternoon in intensive care, still fighting the virus.
I understand he is comfortable, he's stable, he's in good spirits. While he's had oxygen, he hasn't been on a ventilator. And I think that we are all, certainly judging by the messages I'm getting from my constituents and others, and certainly from right across the political spectrum, everyone is rooting for the Prime Minister to have a full and speedy recovery.
Mr Johnson is said to be in good spirits and can contact those he needs in number 10. This afternoon, Downing Street has said the Prime Minister is clinically stable and is responding to treatment. So far, that treatment has involved the use of oxygen, but not the use of a ventilator, which would be far more invasive and serious. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, chaired this morning's strategy meeting again as he stands in for Boris Johnson. Mr Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary. The Prime Minister is just fine, he says. But in Mr Johnson's absence, there are still decisions to be made and a strategy to implement, like when the restrictions on our lives might start to ease. By law, ministers have to review regulations every 3 weeks. The first review will be next week. But with the experts saying we haven't necessarily reached the peak of the crisis, yesterday Mr Raab made clear the government still thinks there's work to be done.
We will take any decision when the time is right, based on the facts and the scientific and medical advice. And our number one and our overriding focus right now is to remain absolutely focused on conveying the key message, which is everyone needs to keep adhering to this guidance.
And here's a reminder of why. In Scotland, new figures say coronavirus was mentioned on 354 death certificates, significantly higher than the figures published daily, which cover deaths in hospitals.
The number of deaths covered under this reporting system is therefore larger than under the daily system when you compare the two figures on the same date. It is also, unfortunately, almost certainly more accurate.
And in Wales, this from the government.
It's almost 2.5 weeks since we asked people to stay at home, to work from home whenever they can, and to stop making unnecessary journeys. These measures will stay in place next week.
A few weeks ago, scenes like this were almost unthinkable. Now they're part of life and could be for a while yet. Nick Eardley, BBC News, Westminster.
Let's go to Downing Street and join our political correspondent Helen Catt, because we've had an update really just in the last few minutes, Helen.
Yes, an official update on the state of the Prime Minister's health from number 10 by his medical team at London St Thomas's Hospital. They say that he remains clinically stable, he is responding to treatment, and that he continues to be cared for in the intensive care unit. He has not been on a ventilator and he remains in good spirits. Now, number 10 also confirmed that he is not working. He is, as I said, in intensive care. So it is still Dominic Raab who is deputising for him here as the work of government does go on, and they've got some pretty important things to get done. For example, reaching that target of 100,000 tests a day by the end of this month. Now, we've got a bit more news on that for you in the last sort of few minutes as well. 20,000 NHS staff and their families have been tested, and there are now 13 drive-through testing sites across the UK. A little bit more too on that question about whether lockdown restrictions would be lifted. The government is expected to review the restrictions next week, but it is not expected to change them necessarily. And the focus, the number 10 spokesman said, is on relentlessly stopping the transmission of this disease.
Helen, thank you, Helen Catt. Well, as we heard, figures released in the last hour in Scotland suggest more people have died after contracting coronavirus than previously announced. Let's find out more from our Scotland correspondent, Lorna Gordon. Explain more about this, Lorna.
Jane, there's been a big jump in the deaths linked to COVID-19 here in Scotland. These new statistics from the National Records of Scotland show that 354 people have died after testing positive for COVID-19, and also includes the deaths where the virus was a probable contributing factor. It goes up to the period ending last Sunday, so it's not directly comparable to those daily statistics we have been getting so far. But it is broader, it is more accurate, and these statistics do give more details. We know now where the deaths are occurring. More than a third are in Greater Glasgow and Clyde. There have been no COVID-19 related deaths in Orkney or in the Western Isles. The statistics also show that older people are more likely to die from COVID-19, but that younger people are dying as well. They show that 4 people in the age group between 15 to 44 have died of COVID-19 here in Scotland. So they're not directly comparable to those daily statistics, but they are more accurate, and they give important details of how many people are dying with this disease, not just in hospitals, but in community settings, so in their homes and in their care homes as well.
All right, Lorna, thank you. Lorna Gordon. Well, with the long Easter weekend coming up, the lockdown across the UK will be put to the test. New polling suggests there is broad public support for the way the police are enforcing the rules, as our health correspondent Catherine Burns reports.
This is not what lockdown is meant to look like. Sunbathers on the beach, overflowing car parks, busy footpaths and pavements. But many people have been sticking to the rules, staying at home to help cut the spread of coronavirus. We're 16 days into lockdown, and now there's some very cautious optimism.
It's possible that we're beginning to see the start of a change where we might see numbers flattening off. We won't be sure about that for a week or so, and we need to keep looking at it. But it does begin to suggest that things might be moving in the right direction in terms of numbers, and it's important that we carry on with the measures we've got in place in order to make sure that this does go in the right direction.
And now, with a 4-day weekend where the weather's expected to stay warm for most of the UK, that message is being reinforced over and again.
It's really important for us to follow the rules. Exercise once a day, keep your distance from one another. You shouldn't be sunbathing, you shouldn't be having picnics. Those things lead to the virus spreading faster, which puts more pressure on the NHS, which will mean more people dying.
A poll suggests that most people support how the rules are being enforced. Around 3/4 questioned by YouGov said they were comfortable with police giving out fines and even arresting people who refused to go home. But others, around 1 in 3, thought some officers had gone too far. 29-year-old nurse Becca Mack died at home in Northumberland on Sunday night. She'd been sick with coronavirus for about 2 weeks. Her friend Sarah had to phone around letting people know.
Just how time stands still, but it was just a really surreal day, calling people and hearing people's heart rate on the phone.
Is there anything else you want to add?
I know that the longer this goes on, the easier it might be for people to feel like the rules are relaxing a bit, but please just stay at home, and please tell your friends to stay at home, and tell them how much you love them quite frequently, because you just don't know.
Meanwhile, the new temporary NHS Nightingale Hospital in London has started taking its first patients. We're not at the peak for this virus yet, and until we're past that, we can realistically expect more messages telling us to stay at home. Catherine Burns, BBC News.
China has placed a city on its northern border with Russia under lockdown after a surge in the number of coronavirus cases there. It comes as many of the travel restrictions in Wuhan, where the epidemic began, are lifted. Let's find out more from our correspondent Stephen McDonald in Beijing. Tell us exactly what's going on then.
I mean, look at Wuhan, the city where the global coronavirus emergency started. They've been cut off from the outside world now for more than 10 weeks. So imagine what the feeling is like to be able to start to leave the city. or for people to return there if it's their hometown. Now, many analysts are debating the extent to which we can trust China's official figures. But observers would say, don't worry about the numbers, look at what the Chinese government does. And there's a feeling that the elite of the Chinese Communist Party would not have re-established transport links with Wuhan unless they were reasonably sure that they were bringing this emergency under control. Now, it doesn't mean the crisis isn't over here. You know, restaurants are capping numbers. You can't go into a neighbourhood or an apartment block unless you're a resident. You have to wear a face mask in order to go into a building. But every little bit of opening gives people more hope, and I'm sure overseas others are watching China and taking a little bit of hope from that as well. And either way, if it starts to go wrong, like in this city bordering Russia, they're able to just lock it down again, because Chinese citizens coming across the border there's a threat of them reintroducing the virus, so that the lockdown there now in that small city is as strong as it was in Wuhan. But nevertheless, a very positive day when you consider that this city is where it all started.
Yeah, Stephen McDonald in Beijing, thank you. The European Union's top scientist has resigned, saying he's frustrated